Good afternoon. I'm Mark Nelson, Professor of Philosophy here at Westmont and Director of the Dallas Willard Research Center in the Martin Institute. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Provost Lecture. And if you're a visitor to Westmont, welcome to Westmont. It's also my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Dr. Michael Stewart Robb. Dr. Robb has a BA in Christian Education from Wheaton College in Illinois, and an MA and PhD in Theology from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And he is now a scholar, pastor, ordained Presbyterian minister who has lived for many years in Munich, Germany. He's also a published author with a recent article in Theology Today, which is a major deal, and a book published by one of the leading theological presses, T&T Clark. That book, The Kingdom Among Us, The Gospel According to Dallas Willard, is the winner of last year's Dallas Willard Research Center Book Award. I say last year, we had arranged for Mike to come to campus in January, I believe it was, but catastrophic weather forced us to cancel those plans. But we're delighted that we're able to have him back. And let me explain why. And here I need to make a little detour to explain that award. For those of you who don't already know about him, Dallas Willard was a Christian philosopher and pastor and author of numerous books such as The Spirit of the Disciplines, Divine Conspiracy, and Life Without Lack. Supported by the Martin Institute here at Westmont, the Dallas Willard Center is working to place an enduring emphasis on the intellectual legacy of Dallas Willard, including his focus on the possibility of and path to authentic spiritual and moral transformation. Dallas passed away in 2013, but his reputation and influence continued to grow. And here I've written in my script, we're pleased to have members of the family with us this afternoon. Apparently, they're stuck in traffic on the 101. So we're hoping that they will join us. But anyway, we are grateful for their support. We're grateful for the support of Patty and F. Martin as well, and also for Kim Deneau, our provost. This is under her aegis. She is a co-sponsor of this event. The annual book award was created in 2015 to recognize and encourage exemplary scholarship, reflecting the intellectual commitments that characterized Dallas Willard's work. Those commitments are, and I'm going to read some long words here now. 1, robust metaphysical realism. 2, epistemological realism. 3, the development of comprehensive integrative models of the human person. 4, the development of objective measurement for different Christian formative practices that in principle can place those practices in the domain of publicly accessible knowledge. Now for you non-philosophers, allow me to translate that into Californian. It means this: things are real and we can know them. People are real too, and they have bodies, minds, souls, and wills. And we should study people in ways that do justice to these facts and that show how and whether Christian spiritual practices really do work. Across his many books and talks, Dallas wove these ideas into a vision that has been profoundly influential in the lives and thinking of many pastors and lay people. But until now, it has been underexplored by academic theologians. Michael Stewart Robb's book is the first full-length scholarly exposition of the coherent, logical, unified theological vision that Willard presents. And that vision is not some idle exercise in abstract theology. It is first and foremost a presentation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and one that is confirmed in the experience of his followers, past and present. Tomorrow, we'll be presenting Dr. Robb with his award. This afternoon, we've asked him to give us a taste of the fruits of his research. He plans to speak about 50 minutes, that's 50, after which we'll have time, 15, 20 minutes or so, for questions and comments from the audience. We've been told that we should wrap this up at 5 minutes to 5 because there's another event happening that many of the students will want to attend. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Stewart Robb.
Okay, let's try there. No, that's not good for the video, huh? Thank you. Well, thank you, Mark. Put my glasses on. I can see you at least for once, but I've kind of reached the age where now I can't see my notes when I do that, so I have to just take them off, and we'll just assume that you're all there still. I live in Germany, work as a writer, and as a writer, kind of the dress code is like Big Lebowski kind of thing. So I did find these things, and even I ironed a shirt for the first time in 2 years. My 7th grade teacher, home ec teacher, taught me how to do that. I have chosen Rational Spirituality of Dallas Willard, Claiming the Depth and Power of Protestant Spiritual Life for my title. I'm probably not going to say a lot about that subtitle, in case that was why you really wanted to come here. I'm sorry. But I hope with the label Rational Spirituality that there's some dissonance there. That's what I chose it for that reason. At least I think for some people there's some dissonance around rational spirituality. Do those two go together? Once I heard a speaker talk about Dallas Willard as his gateway drug to the vast spiritual tradition of spiritual writing that has been produced by Christians, non-Christians, half-Christians, and I think that that comes from a larger mindset in the churches and the schools and among authors, and I don't mean that as a criticism of this author. He probably meant it as a compliment to Dallas Willard, but the idea, this mindset, I think, comes with a story, and the story is that we Protestants, people with Willard's background, or we evangelicals, if you want to call Willard that, we've been swimming in spiritually shallow waters, and our knowledge of and interaction with spiritual reality has been inch deep. But about 40 to 50 years ago, a few evangelical Protestants, especially Dallas Willard, were snooping around outside of Protestantism, and they stumbled on a gold mine of spiritual treasure, which goes back to the early church itself. We knew about the biblical stuff, but like right after that, we kind of were clueless. And so some non-Protestant traditions have always known about this century-spanning spiritual gold mine, but we Protestants were only getting our feet wet. There are, I think, two pillars to this mindset. First, I've already kind of mentioned it. There's a particular assessment of Protestantism. That is, we Protestants are spiritually simple, unsophisticated in spiritual things. We're poor in spirit, as Jesus says. And then second, that spiritual writing over the last 2,000 years speaks with a unified voice. So if you start reading Dallas Willard one day, you'll be reading Jacob Boehme the next. And if you start fasting with Dallas Willard one day, you'll be whipping yourself with Catherine of Siena the next. Right? It's one thought world. And these spiritual writers, they basically say the same thing. And Willard is kind of like this slippery slope, which might be viewed positively or negatively depending on which side of the slope you want to stand or you want people to be on. So what I want to do in this lecture is to just blow some smoke away around Dallas Willard and just try to bring some clarity to Dallas Willard's place as a spiritual writer within this vast tradition. I'm going to compare Dallas Willard to another doctrinal formational tradition, and this is the point. You'll see if I succeed, this is what I'm doing. All I want to say is they don't agree. They're not saying the same thing. So it's not more complicated than that, but let's go for it. What I want to make a statement first, and that is that Dallas Willard was not a mystical theologian, and was in fact opposed to mystical theology. He was, in the words of C.A. Campbell, a rational theist. C.A. Campbell was not a rational theist. He didn't think that that was possible, but Dallas Willard does think it's possible. The slippery slope view of Dallas kind of comes from impreciseness of terms, especially things like spiritual, spirituality, mystical, mystic, mysticism. The nouns are modern, so spiritual, spirituality, and mysticism, kind of from the last few centuries, but the adjectives are actually ancient, and so Christian writing over 20 centuries has put these words to any number of uses. By Willard has as well. This porridge of terms and within this porridge of terms and spiritual traditions, I just want to make one distinction, which will be helpful for us. There are at least two types of mysticism. The type 2, we'll call it type 2, is present throughout history, but it's well represented by a person like Julian of Norwich. Julian is a devout lady of the 14th century who has revelations. That is, she's definite events in which she's encountered by God in quiet presence and conscious speech. And so you see that kind of thing later in George Fox and John Wesley, John Wimber, and in less autobiographical forms in Luther, Calvin. This is a kind of mysticism with which Protestantism is very comfortable. It usually doesn't get labeled mystical. It's just kind of a thing, spiritual life, encounters with God. Type 2, that was type 2. Type 1, and these are not necessarily exclusive of each other. Type 1 is mystical theology, which I'll explain in a second. If there's a contemporary tendency to confuse the two, it comes from writers like, I'll mention a name, Evelyn Underhill, who has embraced both of them and written about them as if they are one and the same. So, and she's able to accomplish this first because she doesn't engage with doctrines. Which she takes to be a strength and appropriate to her subject matter. So, not going to deal with doctrines. One of her famous rules of mysticism, so identifying true mysticism, is that it is active and practical, not passive and theoretical. So you hear that theoretical thing, it's not theoretical. Another way that she's able to do this, or another thing to see about what she does, is she's kind of turn of the 20th century, Evelyn Underhill. She's executing a typical move of 19th and 20th century liberal theology, which is that you sweep away all the theoretical and doctrinal concerns of your subjects in order to, lo and behold, find the unity among them in experience. Now that experience may be rational or it may be non-rational, but the experience is kind of, oh, look, we're kind of all on the same team. So what is this other type of mysticism, mystical theology, which I say Willard opposes? First, actually, this helps me. I mean, if I heard this term, mystical theology, I mean, maybe we can raise some hands and that will help me know how. Okay. Mystical theology is a human intellectual tradition. It's important to sort of recognize that it's a kind of teaching. And it's a vast tradition with many variations, which differ both in theory and in praxis. So there are non-Christian versions of it, which perhaps might not even qualify as a theology, something more like a philosophy or something of that sort. But because of this vastness, I'm just not going to be able to give a history and analysis of it all here. So I'm just going to have to restrict myself to the kind of the Christian variations and to just name two characteristics of it. But these are kind of important because they'll cycle through in the lecture here. So keep track of them. The first one has to do with what mystical theology says about metaphysics or theologically. Theologically, the biggest claim is that God is beyond something. Now, what exactly God is beyond is where these different variations start to show up, where you start to see these different types of mystical theology. So one big variation, who we should name, is Plato, who's really one of the grandfathers of mystical theology. Plato, I've mentioned him because he's very easily recognized. Plato puts the good, or personalized, if you wish, God beyond the category of individuals, right? So individuals, for Plato, inhabit the world of time and are subject to change. And so you have change in time in order to be an individual. And what makes anything an individual is that it has change in time. Now, if you remove the change in time, all you are left with is the universal forms, the universals, and at the climax, or at the origin of these, is the form of the good, or God, if you wish. Now, Platonic thinking starts mingling with Christian thinking early on, and it helps followers of Jesus in a number of ways. And this isn't an attempt to sort of, I think philosophy is very useful to us, and it's a good thing that Plato and Aristotle and these folks were around to help Christians as in their thinking. So this isn't an attempt to bash Platonism or anything like that. As Dallas Willard said, Plato and Aristotle got in at the ground level. So there's sort of a perennial usefulness to what they were doing as in philosophy. But one thing that Platonic thinking did not help Christians with very well is thinking about how God might be an individual. So if you put God beyond individuals, that means, well, God cannot be an individual. It's beyond them. See, Platonic thinking, it's fascinated with predicates. This is a philosophical term. It means just how things resemble or different. So, yellow or red, these are predicates, right? This is to the left of, to the right of. So Platonic thinking loves predicates. And it knows it has to deal with individuals. Individuals are things that can't be predicated of something else. So it knows it has to deal with them, but it deals with them by demoting them. So the best stuff are the predicates, and then the individuals are kind of stepped down. Well, obviously that becomes a bit of an issue for God, because you got to put him at the top. Platonists aren't monists. Monism is this idea that everything is just one thing, right? So that's not Platonists sort of have a pluralistic universe, different kinds of things, but they deal with these individuals by sort of creating a kind of hierarchy. Now this is kind of difficult for readers of the Bible to swallow, this idea. And you might have a hard time combining the stories and teachings of God from the Bible with the idea that God is not an individual. Might be a difficult one for you. But I think for lack of alternatives, Christians tried very hard to swallow this one. And it gives birth to major variations of this Christian mystical theology, if not really to the whole tradition for us Christians. So God is beyond individual existence, meaning he's beyond change in time, or God is beyond change in time, meaning he's not an individual. Now, one of the followers of Jesus, and I mean that without tongue-in-cheek, who swallowed about as much as one could swallow without at least giving up on the impression that he was reading the Bible and immersed in his church setting, is this 5th to 6th century Syrian known to us as Pseudo-Dionysius. Anybody, you heard of Pseudo-Dionysius? He convinced a lot of people all the way up until the 15th century humanists and reformers that he was Dionysius the Areopagite, who was a convert of Paul. He kind of wrote under this pseudonym, and it was very successful. Now, for Pseudo-Dionysius, the idea is that God is beyond everything. God is beyond even beyond those general predicates that Plato, God is good, but he's really beyond good. God is being, but he's really beyond being. God is life, but he's really beyond life. He's wisdom, but he's really beyond wisdom. That is knowledge, and that last beyond is the one that we often associate with Pseudo-Dionysius, this negative theology tradition, which he's not the only, but one of the major contributors to. But we'll just set that aside for the moment, because what I really want to focus on is this beyond metaphysics that grounds it. God is beyond these general categories. So Dionysius knows this definitively about reality, he would say. That God might be an individual or subject of properties is not an idea that he's willing to consider. He just knows definitively that God can't be that kind of thing. You see, Dionysius, he doesn't really have a way of thinking of individuals as eternal or personally causal. Of course, he could have gotten an unsophisticated one from the Bible, especially the Old Testament, or Aristotle might have helped, but Aristotle wasn't really read all that seriously then. And so you kind of have to wait until the Middle Ages when they're looking more at Aristotle till they kind of can start to think about, okay, maybe God is individual. Aquinas will talk about God as a substance and having sort of causal, being personally causal. I shared this paper with a friend who is a patristic scholar and actually studied under a person for whom Pseudo-Dionysius was a sort of major research topic. And he constantly wanted me to kind of qualify. And I want to say this again. I think Pseudo-Dionysius is a Christian man, and for the people who try to defend him, they're always a little touchy about calling him a Platonist or a Neoplatonist, because it means you're saying, well, he's just a pagan. He's not really a real Christian. And I'm okay with that. I mean, Augustine was a Neoplatonist too. I mean, well, there's lots of people that's just I'm okay with him. I hope I meet him in heaven. We can talk about this. Or her. We don't know. Anyway, where was I? Where were we? I've got sidetracked. Oh yeah, about God can't be an individual. So it becomes a bit of it's a feature of mystical theology, and it kind of keeps it in opposition to rational theism and metaphysical realism. It becomes a bit of a liability for the church. So second, that's the first characteristic. All right, something metaphysics, beyond metaphysics. The second one here is about the epistemology. Now, when we get to the epistemology, you explained all these terms here in California speak, Mark. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that, but I'm trying to. This is tough stuff, and so if you're with me, you're doing really well. So when you get into the epistemology stuff, then it starts to sound more like the stuff we associate with mystic and mystical. But it also starts to move away from Plato. Plato was pretty confident in his ability to know the good. But anyway, for mystical theology, the biggest claim is that God can't be known through conceptual, intuition, or representation. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful. Conceptual, I guess, in other words, is rational. So rational intuition or representation. Representation is more like when you think about something that's not there. So you think about frogs, right? We don't have any frogs in here. We think about frogs. We can represent them in our minds. And intuition is closer to when that thing's actually there, not necessarily even spatially time present there. We can talk about an intuition of God, and we're not saying God's like an empirical object, sense perceptible. We smell God now or something like that. But God can't be known through conceptual, intuition, or representation. Meaning, I guess the California of this is you can't think about him or intuit him rationally. God's incomprehensible to us. To himself, maybe not. But we can't have conceptual or rational knowledge of him. It said you get a little bit of this in Plato's Parmenides, but like I said, Plato is pretty confident that he can know the good. Origen, also, you get a little bit of it, but he really kind of thought that you passed through. If he had a sense for the incomprehensibility of God, he thought it was like we pass through. It's like a stage of prayer. You pass through an inability to understand God in the darkness, but then you actually pass through to a place of actually understanding him, for Origen. And so it's really the Neoplatonists. They're like 4th century. I get the third century. No, well, it develops over time. So I don't know really when the cutoff to Neoplatonists is, but before Augustine, before Pseudo-Dionysius, it's folks like them, Gregory of Nyssa, and Pseudo-Dionysius, who set the tradition of this doctrine of God is incomprehensible. Now, if all you know is sort of modern skepticism and agnosticism, you might think, well, that's the end of the story. We don't know God, so we'll just do something else. But actually, knowledge is very, very important for mystical theology and in the ancient world. See, both in its pagan forms as well as in its Christian forms, mystical theology works with what might be called a soteriology of knowing. That is, through knowledge we are saved, and so it is through our increasing knowledge of God that we return or ascend or are restored to our original state of wholeness or oneness with him. Now there are, if you don't know it, very strong Platonic and Neoplatonic echoes in that kind of soteriology of knowing, and also biblical echoes. I hope that those ring a bell. This idea of knowledge as salvific, knowledge as just what this broken world needs. And there's an element of this soteriology of knowing in all of the church fathers, and really it's quite common. There's a wonderful book by Ellen Cherry who goes through all these figures all the way up to Calvin. She kind of stops there and shows about how this soteriology of knowing is present in our past. So in the mystical theologians too, the unknowability of God is paired with this great human need to know God. Well, let's hold that for a second, and I want to zero in on this big epistemological claim that's in mystical theology, which is its denial of conceptual intuition or representation of God. There are multiple reasons for this, why they felt that they had to say that. One is that all of the church fathers, so Pseudo-Dionysius, Augustine, but also most modern theologians up until our day, they did not have an access to a philosophy of mind that entailed intentionality. Now, if you've swum around sort of Dallas Willard waters for a while, you've heard of this intentionality thing, and this will become important in a moment, and I'll explain it in a second here. But for a long time, the idea, the philosophy of mind was that in order to know something, you had to have the form of it in your mind. So form is like a universal, and I had lunch this morning with Daniel Napier, and he's great on this ancient philosophy stuff, and he explained it to me once more, and it's like you're going to know a carrot, you're going to have that form of carrotness in your mind. Otherwise, you can't know it. It's a kind of like you have to have both the carrot and the form of the carrot in your mind. To anything else, yellow, you're going to have the form of yellow in your mind. You're going to know fish, you have the form of fish in your mind, so on and so forth. Now, apply that to God, and you have a situation in which you, as a finite, subordinate human mind, in order to know God, must have the form of God in your mind. And so, to which rightly should be responded, fat chance. It's not going to work. So it becomes why this incomprehensibility becomes important. They really didn't have another model for what the mind did in knowing. Another reason for this kind of emphasis on incomprehensibility has to do then also with this ontology of God as beyond. So especially in this variety of that says God is beyond individuality, which a thinker like Pseudo Dionysius has committed himself to. Because of that commitment on the ontological front, when you get to the knowledge front, Pseudo Dionysius must limit himself to encounter with God or exposure to God, but without concepts. There's really nothing else left. There's nothing for him to grab on. See, even if he had these infinite concepts, the concept of God's infinite goodness in his mind, if that could be some sort of form in his mind, they wouldn't reach out and grab onto anything in God because God is beyond that stuff. So this is careful here. I think sometimes we think that mystical theologians like Dionysius are seeking experience, and that's perhaps a little misleading for us as moderns because Pseudo Dionysius didn't get to read Aristotle, at least not very carefully, as we have, or didn't know the empiricists, didn't know the phenomenologists, and so he didn't really quite understand. It's not experienced in the same way. It's in modern language, it's better to say that Dionysius seeks enlightenment, but without concepts, which are pointless anyway. So lest we forget, there's a whole soteriology attached to this. So knowing God is the best thing that could happen to a human. So you're after these encounters or the enlightenment that comes by being in touch with God, but so that kind of becomes what knowledge is, but you have to do it without concepts because the concepts are useless, and because if you had them, then you'd have something like infinite concepts in your mind, and that's tough. Let's see here. Well, those are the two. Those are the two. For you guys, kind of got at least a rough idea of mystical theology. This is an intellectual tradition. It's a broad tradition. It's something that you can definitely study. The library here has plenty of books on this kind of thing. You can read Pseudo Dionysius yourself. And I've jumped over a lot. I've had to paint in broad strokes, but I hope you can already spot some of the differences to this other type of mysticism that I mentioned about God's gentle presence and conscious speech. Mystical theology is much more dogmatic and theoretical than that other type. But it does have a tough go in the history of thought. I mean, not everybody thinks that, but there's a few reasons for that. It had a hard time figuring out what to do for Christians to do with the doctrine of creation. So God kind of has to be this causal something in order to create, and so that's hard. Different varieties sort of try to do that, but that's always this thing that's sort of knocking on the door of mystical theology in its more pagan forms. Is how do you deal with creation? Kind of severs it from Platonism. Second thing that happens is Platonism, especially Neoplatonism, ceases to seem intellectually necessary. So for the longest time, that was really the best thing going, and then other options start to come onto the table. And so in the middle and late medieval ages, individuals and substances now pose no problem. God knows them, God loves them, and God is one. There's still debate about universals in the Middle Ages, but there's a few different options for dealing with those. And then another thing is that in the Christian tradition, Dionysius is discovered as a kind of clever, forgery. I know that kind of sounds negative, but what it means is that then people can read him with more distance. See, when Aquinas from the 13th century reads Pseudo Dionysius, he thinks he's right after the apostles. So it's really hard to sort of say, we don't need those books for him. But then once you sort of realize, 5th, 6th century, kind of you're able to sort of read them. Doesn't mean you have to throw them in the trash, but you read them with a different set of eyes. Dallas Willard, I said I was going to talk about Dallas Willard. So we'll compare these two things to Dallas Willard's. And here you have a different spiritual theology that's at work here. Dallas Willard has a realist, rational theology, and like I said, one that's largely incompatible with mystical theology, and in the two respects that I just mentioned, and probably more. If there's a topic which shows up everywhere in Dallas Willard's work, but rarely comes to the surface, it's the doctrine of God. It just shows up everywhere, but he never sort of sits down and says, okay, let me tell you what I think about who God is, what God is. And I think, however, one of the most helpful things that Dallas did as a spiritual writer was to insist on the need to not think of God as an oblong blur. That's his word. He writes in The Divine Conspiracy, we cannot, even by miracle, believe a blank or a blur, much less act on it. There's no what for our minds and lives to lay hold of in such a case, or it is the wrong what. So he, in his life, insists on a realist, rationalist theology, and he pursues one. There's this phrase that he uses as a rare lecture in which he actually does talk about God directly, and in that lecture he talks about God as a self-subsistent spiritual substance of limitless power. I kept talking about conceptual representation. These are concepts here that I just went through. Self-subsistent spiritual substance of limited power. So that's the kind of thing that we're talking about there. I want to narrow in on this substance thing. God is a substance for Dallas. God is an individual. Already, you see, he's crossed a line that mystical theology wouldn't cross, or maybe just didn't know how to cross. He has this phrase, it shows up in The Divine Conspiracy, the substantiality of the spiritual. And what he's referring to there, above all, is God. God is alone ultimate substance. The first time I've heard him use that phrase, he was talking, this is the early 80s, about the insubstantiality of material substance, the insubstantiality of material substance. See, it's not as if, ask Mark about this all afterwards here, about all this stuff. Sorry, try to
Bit of help.
do some marketing for your philosophy classes. It's not as if we look at the world of matter and we see all these particulars and substances, and then by squinting our eyes and using a bunch of not very helpful metaphors, we kind of see, oh yeah, God's kind of a substance like that too. It's rather that, for Dallas, if anything has a right to be called a substance, God is that thing. This is what Dallas means by metaphysical realism. Not entirely, but at least in part. Substances are real, God is one. If you do actually go to philosophical conferences and you say something like substances are real, I don't know, you probably won't make a lot of friends these days. But, maybe?
You could do worse.
You could do worse. Okay. Okay. Another way of saying what I just said, and I know this might not actually be very helpful for some of you, but God is included in general ontology, is what Dallas is saying. He's included. Dallas Willard taught a course on metaphysics or general ontology 28 times in his life. And so these are very important questions for him, dealing with them with students. And so when we start asking general ontology questions, I'll tell you what they are, like what it is to exist, what kinds of things exist, what exists ultimately, we are not excluding God from the discussion. Okay, excluding God from those questions is the basic move of mystical theology. God is beyond. What's he beyond? He's beyond particulars, he's beyond individuals, he's beyond predicates, he's beyond classification, he's beyond existence, he's beyond general ontology. Now, I just want you to see the difference. I'm not trying to make a judgment here about the two. I'm just trying to, I'm just trying to blow away smoke. Okay, that's all I'm trying to do. If you want to explore mystical theology, go ahead, talk to Mark about it afterwards. God is a substance. What does that mean? Here's one of Willard's formulations. God is a being of specific properties and powers united into one person. God is a being of specific properties and powers united into one person. So let's break that down. That means, first, God exists exactly like us in a number of very basic and probably uninteresting categories. God is a being who, like us, exists. Willard holds this observation that Kant made, that every subject of properties exists or has being. That's Kant. Every subject of properties exists or has being. God exists or he has being because God is the subject of properties. Again, properties are like, yellow and self-subsistent and things like that. So are we. We are also subjects of properties, so are rocks. God is not beyond us or anything in that sense. All right? Another thing that Dallas means by that is that God is a being of specific properties and powers. That means God has a definite kind of being. He's not beyond definition, as the Neoplatonists would and Pseudo Dionysius would have it. He has definition. He has finitude of a specific kind. He's not all inclusive. He's one thing and not another. Specific properties and powers. You don't need to list out or even know all of the properties and powers of God in order to say that God's a substance. That being a substance is a rather boring kind of thing. It's not very special. Rocks have specific properties and powers. So does dog vomit, which is a biblical term, by the way. So by saying that God is subject of properties and powers and is therefore substance, it doesn't mean that you have to pin down the properties. And this is often the thing that people are a little worried about, is if you start doing that, you're going to lose all mystery. It leaves lots of room for mystery or for lack of understanding, both about God and about dog vomit. Lastly, God's properties and powers are united in one person. What that means, let's go with entity rather than person. It means that it all substantial unity is a unity of exclusion. They're sort of it's a distinguishing one thing from another. It's a unity of individuality. This is sort of the properties go around this one individual. And even though mystical theology is big on unity, it's not very big on this idea of exclusion. Well, that's a beginning, and what it amounts to is that the God of the Bible is included into general ontology. He's not beyond classification. How you guys doing? This is Dallas Willard taught about this stuff too, not just about the stuff in Spirit of the Disciplines, which is good too. Second thing, Willard's epistemology. So God's not beyond rationality, at least not beyond it in some basic and boring ways. God, if he exists like every other kind of object or personal, impersonal that exists. Notice that we haven't even, we still haven't gotten to philosophical theology like arguments for God's existence or revealed theology, like what does the Bible say about this stuff. We're still talking about general ontology, and but it's a significant parting of the ways from the idea that God can't be known with through conceptual intuition or representation. Claiming that God exists like everything else exists is a conceptual representation, right? So we're thinking about him in rational, albeit very minimal ways. And so here's now where we need to call up intentionality, which I said church fathers, really most medieval theologians, philosophers didn't appear to have any knowledge of. So this, well, I guess I won't assume that you do. It's a philosophy of mind that was investigated by Edmund Husserl. So Dallas Willard studied Edmund Husserl, and other people explored it as well, and Dallas takes it over in large part. Again, this breakfast with Daniel Napier, he said Dallas thought that there are very few really significant philosophical discoveries over time, but intentionality is one. This is an important one if you care at all about this stuff, to kind of get your mind around. So according to this intentionality is a philosophy of mind, so it's a way that our minds work. According to this theory, when you think about an object, your minds don't, as the church fathers held, take on and literally share the form of the object. So you don't have to worry with intentionality about your mind taking on the form of God's perfect goodness, or it becoming a literal property of your mind. According to Willard and the other sort of intentionality folks, when we think of an object, we think of or at. I'm going to read this so that I get it right. According to Willard, when we think of an object, we think of or at or toward the object, the one outside our minds, outside our thinking. So if we think about a great white shark, and we all can now think about great white shark, the direction of our minds is pointing to a great white shark. Even if none exists, even if, perhaps in the last hour all of the great white sharks died, we would still be thinking of a great white shark. And how is that? Because our thoughts would be of a great white shark thoughts. Our thoughts would be of a great white shark thoughts. See, here is how intentionality is liberating in Willard's rational theology. It means that you can think about God in very, very minimal ways with some basic, boring ontological concepts, but also truly be thinking about God, the real one outside of our minds. I think of almost anything I said. This is the one that I want to make sure you guys get. When you think about God, you can use the most babyish terms or the most basic, boring ontological terms. You're still thinking about God, the real God, the one outside of your mind, because that's just what minds do. That's just how minds work. You're already outside. Now, what it does is it allows for a lot of ignorance and mystery, but also for genuine thought. So when we all did our great white shark experiment and thought about it together, probably most of us couldn't think of a great white shark in very much detail, right? I mean, we've seen them on TV, but there's so much we don't know about them. So much we don't know about them. And to begin with, like I said, probably none of us have actually seen one. Has anybody actually seen the great white shark? Oh, we got a couple of people. Look at that. Great. But here's the point, we all thought of one, rationally or conceptually. All right? We all thought of one. Even if an ichthyologist were here, and I had to look up that term, they're the people that study sharks and that person would have to admit a great deal of ignorance about great white sharks, right? So the person wouldn't know, for example, whether all of the great white sharks had died in the past hour or not. So there's lots of room for mystery in this. Second thing, this idea, it can account for the difference between thinking of a great white shark and perceiving a great white shark, right? So those are different experiences, right? One of which is quite a bit safer than the other one, right? So we all had, I could easily sort of throw out the idea, let's think about a great white shark. If I said, well, let's all perceive a great white shark, you'd be quite a bit, well, assume you'd be worried. So you can, an ontology of knowledge, my goodness, I have just packed this with terms, I am sorry. So you can have like an account of knowledge in which our thoughts about great white sharks line up with our perceptions of great white sharks in such a way that we say, aha, that's when I thought they were like, or, I thought they were different than that. In a sense, that's what the ichthyologist is doing too, right? He's got these thoughts about great white sharks and he compares them with his perceptions of great white sharks. So on the intentionality model of knowledge, you have to have both to have knowledge. You have to have both thoughts about things, that's like the theory, if you will, and you have to have the thought-directed perceptions of things. You can't just have perceptions or direct encounters with things, right? So that sort of perceptions or direct encounters of things, that's like the holy grail of mystical theology. That's really what they're after, especially conceptless encounters. I think now it's time to drink that water, which you have graciously. It's not my intent to deny that holy grail here, but I do want to be clear that on the intentionality view of mind, that's not knowledge. That's not knowledge. You need more than that to have knowledge. It might be a common human occurrence, so just raw perceptions of things, raw encounters with things, but it isn't, according to Dallas, epistemological realism. It won't do for you what knowledge will do for you. Which means we won't have a functional soteriology of knowing, which at least I'm rather interested in, and I think that's because the Bible points to it. Well, that's the blowing away of smoke. So I've just tried to blow, and if I'm successful, I've done that. Now I want to say a few things here about this, what I call the unified voice theory, and why this is kind of why people argue for this. I've limited myself to discussing Willard's rational spirituality in terms of his basic boring theism of substances and particulars. But for Willard, there's three paths. This is a summary. Somebody needs to write a full book on this. 3 paths of rational theology. 3 adequate paths for knowing God. The first is the path of philosophy or reason. Second, path of scriptural testimony, often called revelation. And third, path of direct experience. So these are, for Willard, 3 paths that he would use to sort of fill out a theology of God as an individual. They complement each other and they work together in different ways. It's kind of how you would say, what are the specific properties and powers united into one person that make up God? You kind of work with those three paths. Now the last path, this path of direct experience, that's where we might be led to think that Willard and mystical theology are on the same team. But see, that's only, I hope you see this now, that's only if we disregard the central metaphysical and epistemological tenets of mystical theology. We kind of like forget about all that other stuff. Oh yeah, they both are okay with direct experience. I don't think that really deals with it as a cohesive intellectual human tradition, which is certainly what it's been in history. We just isolated or abstracted a propensity in theology, and we're just sort of locating all the instances of it. Okay, so they like this, and he likes this, and at any rate, that move, that attempt, guides one approach to this unified voice theory of mysticism. There's another approach which is less thoughtful, which is simply to leave these terms spirituality and mysticism uninvestigated. You just kind of say, well, they're imprecise, and it takes too long to sort them out, and so tends to be a little bit more of the layman's way to go about things, or practically oriented projects. You just sort of leave things imprecise and say, well, that's good. There's a third argument for it, and this is one I want to kind of, at a school like this, I think you should be aware of this. It's not a reduction of mystical theology. It doesn't sort of work in this impreciseness of terms, but it works with very precise doctrines. There is on the side of mystical theology a great interest in seeing everyone in the world on an unconscious path to their side and their understanding of God. Okay? There's a great interest in seeing that. And I hope maybe you talk about this in your classes here. You might think of this as like the magnet view of God and the shrapnel view of humanity, right? God's pulling all people toward himself. And so from the point of view of mystical theology, there's a very practical interest in identifying the aspects of your life and thought which supposedly are drawing you to their position. So to their churches, to their understanding of God. And Willard's path of direct experience, this idea that he thinks we have direct experience of God, seems to be one of those pieces of shrapnel. I mean, it's a clear commonality, so I'm not denying that at all. But if you study Dallas Willard or other Protestants who are interested in direct experience, like George Fox or John Wesley or those sorts of people, we'll just talk about Dallas Willard. Two things to sort of note. One is that for Willard, direct experience does not discount these other paths. He still thinks that there's this path of philosophy, reason, and he still thinks that there's this scriptural, revelational path, nor the gains won in our general ontology, which is what we've mainly been doing here. What you find in Willard is, in his account of direct experience, is merely a type of that mysticism with which Protestantism has always been compatible. Mysticism as God's gentle presence and conscious speech. So Willard, for his part, did not feel pulled toward mystical theology. He felt rather quite comfortable where he was as a Protestant, because he just knew the Protestant evangelical tradition. He knew the whole tradition. But he saw that Protestantism was a very deep and powerful tradition and had quite a few resources on its side. Well, to conclude, and I'm very excited for your questions here, I think in Protestantism, there's a great desire to appeal to the lowest common denominator, to make Protestantism accessible. Now, there's a positive side to that. It does make it accessible, but there's a negative side to that, is in that it obscures the depth and power that's present in Protestantism as a tradition and as a global movement. And I think it obscures it from us as well. Obscures it from us as well. Now, there is a sectarian streak in Protestantism which leads to our particular version of the gospel of churchmanship, as Dallas calls it. He always would talk about these other gospels that are preached, and he had this third one called the gospel of churchmanship. It's the only one that he used to say the other two are actually true. He didn't think that the gospel of churchmanship was even true. But there's a sectarian streak in Protestantism that does hold to that. The thing about Protestantism is we don't have a magisterium. We don't have a set of books or dogmas that sort of like you have to toe the line here, and there's a great freedom there, and Dallas is one that he really used that freedom to just to read and benefit from non-Protestants and non-Christians. And this is a part of how Dallas approached ecumenism, and it's one of the resources that we have in Protestantism, that we're not limited, at least in those ways. We're limited in other ways, but so Dallas could read all these people, and Suda Dionysius included. That's it. That's it.
We have some time for Q&A. Can I say, if there's anybody who needs to leave right now, you can do so without shame. But why don't we do that sooner than later? And the rest of us can be thinking about our questions. I'm going to propose that, Mike, you field your own questions.
Okay.
I mean, I don't mind doing it, but remove the middleman.
All right.
And so if you have a question or comment, please raise your hand. There's another series of lectures that we have at Westmont that has, I think, a really good tradition. And the tradition is that the first question should be posed by a student, because the tendency will be for all the faculty and pros to jump in and get arguing about at a very high level about things. We can avoid that. I would like it if the first question would go to a student.
Mm-hmm.
That could make for an awkward pause. But
I'm okay with silence.
yeah, but along with that, I'm hoping that you students, if there's a question you have that just feels so basic that you're maybe a little embarrassed even to ask, I hope you just overcome that. So I would like the first question to go to a student, and can you do a slow softball?
Does that apply to former students as well?
Sure. So, whenever you have a question.
I can be the first if no current student is, interested in asking a question.
Why don't you lead the way?
I couldn't help but thinking about Jesus' statement of, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father.
Mm.
And this idea of how we know God, the special revelation and general, all those things with systematic theology. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about that claim of Jesus.
Mhm.
If you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Seen me, you've seen the
With
Father.
the context of today's discussion.
Yeah. I think Dallas would answer this, and I think this is, I'm probably going to answer it in a way that most theologians would be, is that Jesus is not saying there, I am the exclusive source of knowledge of the Father or of God, but that he is a sure or a certain source. So we have, I think you have, if you hold that he's the exclusive one, what you're going to end up with, I think, is a theory in which you have a whole history with the Jewish people who really are clueless about God until Jesus comes along, and then he says, "You see me, you've seen the Father." Yeah, so I think we have to move away from exclusive things. Now, there's some very Christocentric theologians who would perhaps want to push back on that. Christocentric theologians are people who are really trying to find Christ at the center of everything. And yeah. Another way you could go at it is sort of intertrinitarian things. So you could, who is it? Phillips asked him the question, So Phillips asking about this in his unsophisticated way about this, what we would call a person of the Trinity, the Father, and Jesus is just sort of saying, "You got me. That's good enough," in terms of understanding the personality or what you're actually after.
So, in the term mystical theology, where does mystical come from? Why that name? What's the origin of that?
Yeah. I look this up probably about every 3 months, and I always forget the sources of it. Mystical is the term gets used in variety of ways in ancient thought, and really for a bunch of different uses. It's actually less connected with mystery than we perhaps connected. You'd have, say, in Origins, things like, I think it's Origin, the mystical interpretations of Scripture. If there are any other patristics here, patristic scholars, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that refers to the interpretations of Scripture which point to Christ, and you're sort of reading this sort of second level sort of things to sort of, boy, if I have to take that one back, I'm sorry, but it's not necessarily even a Christian term in its original forms. I don't know that it really even has much. Might have to take that one back. A unified meaning in the ancient world, but like I said, you can find that stuff in you grab get something by McGinn, Foundations, Origins of Mysticism, I think is what it's called, and he does a really good job with that term and sort of explains where those things come from, much better than I'm doing right now. Yeah.
Thanks for being here. Appreciate your talk. I was wondering how you and Dallas would have understood God's involvement in our intentionality.
Okay.
Like you were talking about Plato, and maybe something to be avoided would be humans trying to reach up for understanding this transcendent good or God. But the Christian God's involvement coming down.
Yeah.
the opposite.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's start with Dallas would probably say having intentionality being the way our minds work is just the way that he created us. So that's the way in which he created our minds to function in the world. With respect to God's action or involvement in helping us know him, there are this is where what I was talking about with these two different aspects of knowledge with the intentionality model. So you have the one side where you have your thoughts or your representations of God, and then on the other hand you have your perceptions or your actual encounters with God. Now, God is obviously going to be the one who's kind of in charge of showing up and being involved with us. He may also, well, certainly for Dallas, is involved in the side of helping us get those thoughts. That's where revelation comes in. And so there's nothing, why couldn't God speak to us and just sort of say something like, I am such and such a way? That's probably where a lot of our theology lives, is in this sense of just God said, I'm like such and such, and then that's passed to us through tradition, and maybe been confirmed in experiences of people throughout history, and Yeah, but then God's also involved in the side of actually coming and meeting with us. It's not for Dallas all that different from, like I said, this with this great white shark thing. Only that the great white shark doesn't do this revelation bit where he kind of whispers in our ear, I have a fin on my back, or whatever a great white shark would say. So there's that sort of personal, all presence aspect of God that's involved. Does that help? Good. All right, go for it, Ken.
In terms of God as substance
Yeah.
and properties,
Yeah.
those properties from galaxies reading things convertible, are they part of God's essence, or are they separable?
Could you repeat the question just so everybody can hear?
Yeah. So the question was with regard to God as substance and the properties of God. Are the properties convertible, or are they part of the essence of God? No. No, I missed it.
Are they convertible?
Yes.
Are they part of God's essence,
Yes.
inseparable from God?
Inse-
Or are they not?
or are they not separable from God?
Are they separable?
Yeah.
How do you get them if they're separable?
How did he get them if they're separable? I don't think in his mind that they are. I think he's going to go with inseparable. But what's the problem here? If he says they're inseparable, where are we going to get in trouble with?
I don't think they're.
Oh, okay.
But you're going to agree with one.
But you're going to what? Agree with Aquinas?
Yeah.
Okay. That's where he goes then. Yeah. Yes.
I would use the power of the chair and pose my own question. I'd be curious to know what you think or what you would imagine Dallas would say about the following concern. Coming at knowledge of God or awareness of God, contact with God, by way of this idea of intentionality,
Yeah.
the aimness of thought, rather than through, as we put it, taking on the form of God on the mind, or you might just think in terms of correct concepts.
Mm-hmm.
I can imagine somebody posing the following sort of worry, that makes it very easy for us to fall into a kind of idolatry,
Okay.
in the sense that it, am I thinking about God? Sure I am. I'm pointing to him, aren't I? With my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so then there's the worry that, well, maybe the thing that you think you're pointing to with your mind, maybe the thing you think you're praying to is just your idea of God, a representation, a confused, or erroneous representation of
Okay.
God, and not the Lord God,
Okay.
Yahweh
Yeah.
himself. And so, from your point of view, or what do you find from the point of view of Dallas, what's some guidance? What's a way that we can avoid this kind of idolatrous misrepresentation?
Mm-hmm. I think it's just keep going, keep comparing those thoughts to the real thing, if possible. Compare them. Utilize these three paths as I said. So, reason, scripture, direct experience, and just trust that you will, and probably are wrong about some things. And that's in a sense what one of the ways that Dallas talked about metanoia was think about how you've been thinking. So you're going to constantly take the theory that you have, and they really can't. This is a pretty central feature of Calvinist theology. This idea of we're sort of the human heart is like an idol maker. So we're constantly trying to sort of create idols for God, And the antidote to that is just keep on seeking God, seeking the reality, seeking the true God. Be ready to do metanoia and more metanoia.
Just a brief follow-up.
Yeah.
I should have posed this earlier. It would be open to you to say, actually, I don't think that's it. There's a very serious danger of this sort of idolatry.
Yeah.
Do you think it is, or just overblown?
I don't know that idolatry is the best word for it, but I'm fine. I think that's probably more metaphorical use. I mean, it's just sort of bad theology or something of that sort. But it's Dallas. There's some wonderful stuff out there on how he thought science worked, and a lot science works on the basis of theory, and a lot of the theories that we have as scientists we don't constantly go and check them against reality. But Dallas talked about the need to constantly do that, and he'd talk about it as oh my goodness, I've lost it. It's about the checks. We have to. Yeah, you can't just constantly be writing checks. You have to kind of go to the bank and sort of make sure that those actually that the money's there for the checks. That's a terrible way of describing it. I can't remember the way that he did it. But these theories need to be checked again and again. Yeah, cash the checks. Yeah, we don't use checks anymore. Or at least we don't in Europe.
For you younger people, a check is a
Who we go? Okay, yes.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting and I thought helpful. So
Yeah.
That first. You've been very generous toward the mystical theology tradition,
Mm-hmm.
but there are some pretty straightforward arguments that pseudo-Dionysius is just unintelligible, maybe incoherent. I'm thinking here of the claim that, well, God is the transcendent source of all being, and yet transcendence is a concept, and source is a concept, and so on. And so it seems like there's no way for Dionysius to state his thesis without doing what he says is impossible. Likewise, the claims about God being beyond being strongly suggest and are interpreted by later thinkers as suggesting that God does not exist, even though they seem to be pointing toward. So there's all that. The question is, how much of that do you think affects the mystical theology tradition? If those are disadvantages for pseudo-Dionysius' view, how much of that is a strike against the tradition? Because it sounded like you were defining the tradition in terms of those that would say, because of God's transcendence of one kind or another, we cannot hope for a conceptual contact with God.
Yeah. So how does that affect? Well, a lot of people are still pretty pleased with it. It has become, has gained a little bit more prominence in modern times because I think of rise of skepticism and kind of some failures of modernism. So it seems almost a little postmodern, kind of as and the ecumenical appeal is very, very real. Once you sort of brush aside some of these conceptual things, then there's a sense of, oh, now we're down to the real unity. I mean, I'm not a mystical theologian. Can I give you more in some way, or go ahead?
You can say more or not, but it just seems like you pointed to some of the appeal, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
But that's not a reply to the objection.
Yeah, I'm not.
So
I'm trying to be generous. I'm trying to be more of a historical theologian at this point than a systematic one, I guess.
All right.
I think that's my main.
If that's where we're at, we can just leave that as an invitation to those that find mystical theology attractive. How do we?
Yeah, well, I think those are real. Those are real questions which folks working in. I can name some names. A person like Rowan Williams is rather interested in this kind of thing, and he was Archbishop of Canterbury. And so there's some serious people that are excited about this approach to God, and Rowan Williams is no pushover. So we do have to get in there and talk with these people, and yeah.
I wrote down my questions, so I don't know. Okay, so if Dallas Willard and his whole movement looked outside of Protestantism for this writing on this topic of like understanding the spiritual realm, then do you think that this shows a fundamental lacking in Protestantism? And if you don't, how do you recommend we continue to look outside our tradition for more wisdom on this matter without discriminating?
Yeah. Well, one thing to point out, and I think we Protestants don't help ourselves in this respect. A lot of this stuff is in the called a common tradition. So Protestantism in the 16th century didn't just sort of sprout up out of nowhere. It actually sprouted up in the midst of a long tradition of Christian thought, and all those folks would belong to so Pseudo-Dionysius included would belong to that common tradition, and those are our authors just as much as they are Roman Catholic or Orthodox authors or whoever. And most of the Protestant thinkers back in that time thought that as well. Now, they had their favorites and their sort of people that they didn't like, and that's kind of what we can do as well. We can pick up these people and study them and learn what their merits are and what their demerits are. And I think that Dallas's approach was to just go and try to find the good stuff wherever it is, and that's how he pursued it in philosophy. So I think your question could be just as well asked with respect to non-Christian philosophers and that. So if we start reading them, does that not indicate that there's a sort of lack in our own philosophical tradition? Because then we sort of are acknowledging that they've got something good too. Like, knowing is a pretty difficult thing to be doing. That's why we're trying to do it all together and over time, and it takes a long time to build up an institution like Westmont College where can be surrounded by this much knowledge. And so it's a group effort, historical group effort, and yeah, go for it wherever you can find it. Does that help? Getting there? Okay.
We've got time maybe for two more. So is it Anna, and then perhaps Professor Covington after that.
Just real quick, can you describe to me the difference between type 1 and type 2 again?
Yeah, so type 2, I put them in reverse order here. Type 2, I said, is a good representation is Julian of Norwich, and she has these revelations from God. You can read them. She put them into books. She's the first English woman author, and it's just their revelation, their experiences of her meeting God, God speaking to her, and you can read all sorts of other autobiographical accounts of this in lots of great Protestant authors, lots of great Roman Catholic, Orthodox authors as well. Type 1 was this mystical theology thing that I explained, which had to do with yeah, now you got it?
Yes.
Right. And then you'll find people like Evelyn Underhill, who wrote the turn of the 20th century. She kind of mixes them. Right. Who was the other one? Oh, yeah.
I have two questions, one of which I'll save till afterwards and ask you. But this is a bit of a follow-on, I think, to some of what you said in answer to Professor Vandel's question, which is, it's a little bit of a so what an application question that's inviting you, if you're willing to put on kind of your pastor and cultural observer hat, not just your scholarly hat.
Okay.
But I'm wondering, are there particular contemporary cultural trends or risks, if you will, especially from within Christianity, that you think that people in this room, Protestants, not all Protestants, I expect, but that people in this room might encounter that careful attention to Willard's metaphysical and epistemological realism can provide a corrective or protection, but that kind of what those are might not be obvious to all of us.
So, in particular, Willard's. Repeat it again.
Yeah, just is there a particular set of problems
Yeah.
that are temptations for
Mhm.
Protestants
Yeah.
that Willard's metaphysical and epistemological realism
Yeah.
would help to protect
Mm.
against
Mhm. Mhm.
that might not be easily recognized as such?
Yeah.
Your comments about skepticism and postmodernity give a little bit of a sense of some of the things that are maybe out influences. But I was just curious if this has a particular payoff in sort of where you're envisioning it might go.
You may have stumped me. Think about it here. Trends. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know that they're things that are all that hidden. I mean, I think culturally in North America, if you can get anybody to start talking to you about metaphysics and epistemology, that might already be a win because of the anti-intellectualism that we deal with here, pragmatism and that. So just actually having places where we can discuss this stuff. This is why I think it just always stands out to me, Dallas's prophetic sense of thinking that he should move to Southern California in 1965 to just teach logic and talk about metaphysics and that. It's like, what a bizarre place to be doing that kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. What's that?
We can do logic out here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that I don't know. Well, think about it. I'll write you an email sometime. Well,
We can probably continue the discussion a little longer because we can stay for informal discussion outside. But we've reached the end of our time. Please join me in thanking Michael.